Moscow just went up in flames. The Russian capital has suffered drone strikes before, but nothing comes close to this. In the early hours of August 18th, hundreds of Ukrainian unmanned aerial vehicles blotted out the skies above the city. And while some were eventually shot down, many more went on to strike their intended targets, dishing out millions, if not billions of dollars worth of damage in the process. The war has well and truly come home for the Russians, and while Moscow residents watch their city burn, their so-called strongman leader Vladimir Putin is running for the hills. The massive raid began late on August 17th, with an estimated 637 Ukrainian drones taking off from strategic sites within Ukraine and beginning the relatively long journey over the occupied territories, across the international border, and through enemy airspace to reach the Moscow region, which is situated some 450 kilometers from Ukraine. In the past, such a journey wouldn't have been possible. Russia's vast network of air defenses, including mobile fire teams, missile batteries, and radar stations, would have been able to identify the incoming drones and eliminate most, if not all of them, well before they reached the capital region. Indeed, Moscow has for years been regarded as one of the best protected cities on the planet, with entire rings of defenses erected around the city to ensure that nothing got in. No missiles, no aircraft, no drones. It was vital for Russian President Vladimir Putin to keep his country's capital safe. It helped to preserve his reputation as a strong and capable leader, and it also ensured that the millions of people who called Moscow home, including many of the country's wealthiest residents, were free to go about their lives, enjoying the city's rich heritage and world-famous cultural landmarks, untouched by the horrors of war. And so during the first few years of the war, Ukraine poked and prodded in Moscow's direction, sending small handfuls of drones towards the capital from time to time, but never really making much of an impact, as most of its UAVs were inevitably shot down by the enemy's defenses, and even those that made it through simply lacked the necessary firepower to deal lasting damage. In 2026, however, the state of play has massively shifted. Not only are Russia's frontline forces stalling, but Ukraine's drone army has grown far bigger, better, and more capable than ever before, unlocking the ability for serious, full-scale strikes on the Russian capital. We saw it on June 18th when Ukraine launched its largest ever drone offensive on Moscow. Several hundred drones entered the capital region's airspace that night, with Russian officials reporting that close to 200 were shot down. Some, however, hit their targets, which included the massive Moscow oil refinery, located only 15 kilometers from the Kremlin itself, and this led to large parts of the city effectively being shut down. All the major Moscow airports had flights cancelled, for example, and while some residents watched on in horror as flames and smoke filled the air, others opted to flee the area entirely, seeking refuge in rural regions out of fear that additional attacks would inevitably occur in the weeks and months that followed. They were right. The June 18th strike was just the start of a major Ukrainian offensive against the Russian capital, and the August 17th strike made the opening attack look like child's play. Covering several hundred kilometers of terrain, the swarm of over 600 Ukrainian drones easily evaded Russian radars and air defenses by flying close to the ground and following carefully calculated paths around the enemy's missile systems. A couple of hours after takeoff, they were already closing in on the capital region, with Moscow's air defenses finally beginning to activate. It's highly likely that decoy or dummy drones led the charge. This is a common tactic used by Ukraine's unmanned systems forces that allows them to overwhelm Russia's air defenses and force them to waste missiles and other munitions before the real strike drones begin to enter the area. Then at around 2:30 a.m. Kyiv time, Moscow Mayor Sergei Sobyanin began to report that drones were flying towards Moscow but were being shot down. Sobyanin has a proven track record of twisting the truth to suit his narrative and often frames his statements to make it seem that Russia is in control of every situation at all times. He rarely acknowledges successful Ukrainian strikes and often plays down the amount of damage that Kyiv's forces have done, while exaggerating the efficiency of the capital's defenses. Perhaps this was another example of that. Or maybe he genuinely believed that the attack was being dealt with and that Moscow's protective rings would be sufficient to prevent any serious damage or losses. If so, he was dead wrong. Because this wasn't like past attacks, and Sobyanin was about to learn that fact the hard way. As the night progressed, the Ukrainian drones simply kept coming, and with each passing hour, the mayor was forced back to his social media accounts to issue updates and let the public know what was going on. At 3:30 a.m., for example, he reported that 40 more drones had been shot down while heading towards Moscow. At 4 a.m., he reported 23 more downed drones. By this point, all of the city's 4 major airports, Sheremetyevo, Domodedovo, Zhukovsky, and Vnukovo, had been shut down by the Russian Federal Air Transport Agency. Russian news agency TASS also reported that at least 8 flights had been unable to land in the Moscow region due to safety restrictions. Residents were roused from their beds at the sound of air raid sirens, phone alerts, and the increasingly familiar buzz of Ukrainian UAVs in the air above them. Many rushed to their windows, snatching their phones in their hands to film the scene as air defenses fired into the air and drone debris came raining down from above. Various clips show the city streets plunging into a state of panic and chaos as Moscow was given just a small taste of the sort of horror that has been unleashed on Kyiv and other Ukrainian cities and towns since 2022. And by the time the sun was rising the next morning, Sobyanin was forced to report this had been one of the biggest drone attacks the capital had ever endured. Between yesterday evening and 5 a.m. today, 620 UAVs were flying towards Moscow Oblast, including 180 drones destroyed in Moscow Oblast. Emergency services are working at the sites where debris fell. Some of those sites included residential buildings and a shopping pavilion in Kolomna, as well as a civil registry office building and retail store. The local power grid also took a major hit, with an energy company reporting that many transformer substations had been knocked out over the course of the evening, leaving numerous customers without power in 2 of Moscow's urban districts. Ukraine didn't specifically target these locations. Unlike Russia, it doesn't use its drones to bombard people's homes, hospitals, or similar sites. Instead, these sites were damaged when Russia's defenses shot the drones out of the air. Because once a drone has been disabled, there's nothing the Ukrainian operator can do to prevent it spiraling out of the sky and colliding with whatever happens to be in the way at the time. This didn't stop the likes of Sobyanin and Moscow's regional governor Andrei Vorobyov from attempting to paint the attack as an evil, merciless strike on the city's civilian population. In reality, Ukraine's drones had a very specific target in mind on the night of August 17th. And even though a chunk of the swarm was stopped en route, some drones managed to make it through to their destination, a Wildberries warehouse, situated near the Atlant Park in the Bogorodsky district, located towards the eastern edge of the capital region. It was just the latest in a series of strikes against Wildberries, the so-called Russian Amazon, which has caused devastating effects for the company and knock-on consequences for the Russian military and economy. Before we dig into the details of all of that, if this is the kind of insight you want more of, make sure you are subscribed to The Military Show. We break it down like this every single week. For context, Wildberries is the biggest online retailer in Russia. Over half of all online sales take place on the platform, with millions of Russians relying on Wildberries for all sorts of everyday essentials, electronic goods, fast fashion, and much more. It was founded in 2004 and brings in billions of dollars in revenue each year. On the face of it, the company doesn't appear to be an obvious enemy for the Ukrainian military. But when we dig a little deeper, it's easy to understand why Wildberries has become one of Kyiv's top targets. Because this platform isn't as innocent as it appears at first glance. It doesn't merely sell cheap gifts and accessories, it also sells military equipment and dual-use products that can have both civilian and military applications like drones, camouflage uniforms, and navigation equipment, to name but a few examples. Since Russia's soldiers are often given only the most basic of supplies, many personnel turn to Wildberries to purchase additional items they need to survive on the battlefield and carry out attacks against Ukrainian positions. Realizing this, Ukraine didn't want to simply sit back and allow the retail giant to get away with reinforcing and resupplying the Russian army. And so on July 18th, the Ukrainian Unmanned Systems Forces began what would turn out to be a series of strikes on Wildberries facilities. 2 warehouses were targeted and destroyed that night, one in Elektrostal and another in Kotovsk. A subsequent raid on July 20th resulted in massive damage to a Wildberries logistics center in Kolodino, and since then, many more strikes have taken place, with intense fires and powerful explosions ringing out at Wildberries warehouses far and wide across Russia's regions. The impact of these attacks has been enormous. Experts estimate that close to 2.4 million square meters of Wildberries warehouse space have been affected so far. That's around 43% of the company's total warehouse capacity of approximately 5.6 million square meters. The value of destroyed goods was also estimated on August 14th at around 445 to 507 billion rubles, $5.24 to $5.96 billion. With the latest attack on the Moscow warehouse, that tally is likely to be even higher. In fact, the Association of Suppliers of Goods for Trading on Electronic Platforms, APTEP, an organization with extensive expertise in the kind of business Wildberries does, puts the estimate even higher at around 600 to 700 billion rubles, or $7.06 to $8.24 billion. The company itself is believed to have suffered up to $2.6 billion in direct losses, while thousands of small business owners who rely on it have seen their stock and their companies go up in flames as a result of Ukraine's attacks. And while Wildberries has hastily rewritten its company policy papers to reject any liability for these losses, many of these business owners are taking out their anger on the company and the Russian government and demanding immediate compensation. However, an anonymous Kremlin source who spoke to Reuters revealed that Russia simply doesn't have sufficient free funds to compensate all of the affected sellers, and with the Wildberries strike campaign still ongoing, the chaos is only set to continue from here on out. There will be a wave of bankruptcies, said the source. No one has the kind of money to support sellers. They added that these attacks have dealt a serious blow to the economy, and that's exactly what Ukraine was banking on. The Ukrainian Defense Ministry recently confirmed that 7 out of Wildberries' 10 major logistics centers have now been disabled, and the main intelligence director at HUR has also started a cyber warfare campaign against the retail brand as well. On August 10th to 11th, the HUR's hackers targeted Wildberries' digital infrastructure, disrupting payment systems and customer services. The recent Moscow strike resulted in a fire breaking out at the Bogorodsky Wildberries warehouse, which, just like the others, typically houses many millions of dollars worth of products, which can range from the likes of TVs and tablets to military equipment, books, attire, and household items. Moscow officials were quick to claim that the damage to the facility was minimal, and Wildberries itself issued a statement to say that the site was evacuated, nobody was hurt, and the fire was quickly dealt with. But the fact of the matter is these kinds of statements cannot be taken as gospel. Wildberries is in major damage limitation mode right now, as the company struggles with a crisis it never anticipated, so it will obviously say whatever it needs to say to keep people from panicking even more than they already are. The same goes for Russian officials like Sobyanin and Vorobyov, who are always desperate to downplay the impact of Ukraine's strikes. In reality, with so many drones entering Moscow's airspace, it's more likely that serious damage was done to the warehouse, which could have resulted in huge amounts of losses to goods stored inside. Even if that's not the case, this strike continues to serve as evidence that Ukraine can and will strike wherever it wants, whenever it wants, and that none of Wildberries' facilities are safe. The very fact that over 600 drones managed to strike Moscow is also a damning indictment of how far Russia has fallen. The country that is supposed to have the second strongest military in the world can no longer defend its own capital from an opposing force that is supposed to be so much smaller and weaker. The worst part of all this is that the attack wasn't a one-off, it's becoming a trend. Recent weeks and months have seen numerous successful strikes on the capital itself and surrounding cities, towns, and suburban districts. It appears that Moscow's fabled defensive rings simply aren't enough anymore to keep the people safe, and it's easy to imagine even more destructive and devastating attacks on the home of the Russian government in the near future. Speaking of the Russian government, many Moscow residents might have logically asked the question of where was President Putin while the city was burning. Historically, Putin has spent the bulk of his time in Moscow, in the hallowed halls of the Kremlin, where he feels safest. Recently, however, that started to change as Putin's solid, strongman persona begins to crack and crumble beneath the weight of panic and paranoia. Despite presenting himself to the world for decades as the sort of gritty, grizzled leader who isn't afraid of anything, Putin has, in recent times, appeared to be much more of a frightened figure, increasingly fearful that covert Ukrainian agents might carry out some sort of attempt on his life, or that the enemy's drones might eventually strike at the Kremlin itself. As a result, Putin has been spending more and more of his time further and further away from Moscow and from Ukraine. As Riddle Russia reports, the Russian president was spotted in the Omsk and Irkutsk regions in July, for example. In early August, he was traveling around Krasnoyarsk Krai. From there, he moved on to locations like Buryatia, the Novosibirsk region, and the Sakhalin region, including the Kuril Islands, an extremely remote and sparsely populated archipelago in the Russian Far East, about as far from Ukraine as Putin can technically get without leaving the confines of his own country. This isn't normal. Before the war began, it was very rare to see Putin head so far east. When he wasn't living the life of luxury in Moscow, he spent much of his remaining time in the western parts of Russia, visiting big cities like St. Petersburg and enjoying the opulence of his presidential palace in Valdai. It's worth noting, however, that just days ago, Ukrainian forces managed to wipe out one of the air defense systems, an S-400, that had been installed to protect Putin's palace, sending a clear message to the Russian president that his home was no longer safe and amplifying his paranoia without a doubt. And so he continues his Far East expedition, even while drones rain down on the capital, with upcoming stops expected in places like Altai and the Kemerovo region. What do all of these places have in common? They're out of range of Ukraine's drones. Putin would like the public to believe that this is just a coincidence. He'd argue that he's actually spending so much time in the eastern regions because he needs to whip up some support for his ruling United Russia Party ahead of September's State Duma elections. In reality, that's simply a convenient cover story. As Riddle Russia notes, the choice of regions is unlikely to be accidental. Ukrainian drones and missiles do not reach Siberian cities, the sole exception being the strike on Omsk, and certainly do not reach the Far East. Putin can therefore travel there without serious concern for his own security. In short, the Russian president is running scared. Political leaders would head straight home if they learned of an attack on their country's capital. Putin, however, prefers to plug his ears and pretend that nothing has happened while hiding out in the safest places he can find. The mask has slipped, the strong man has been found out, and Putin's paranoia could eventually spell his end, as even his closest allies may grow tired of his cowardly tactics over time. You can learn more about the many problems mounting up on Putin's Kremlin desk in this video, which looks at how the Russian president has overseen one of the most costly military campaigns in modern history. Alternatively, check out this video for a look at how Ukraine has forced Russia into the worst crisis since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And don't forget to subscribe to the Military Show to avoid missing out on more breaking military news and in-depth reports in the weeks ahead. And thank you for watching.